Welcome back to Talking with Doyle with State Representative Doyle Heffley. As always, we're joined by the indomitable Hunter Kipe and the disembodied voice of producer Chuck on the ones and twos. Doyle, what are we talking about today?
I thought we could talk a little bit about election integrity. Obviously, the upcoming November election is all over the news right now. In the state, there's all the state house members are up for election, as well as the attorney general, the treasurer, the auditor general, and 50% of the Senate. So it is really important that people come out and vote. But yet we've been getting a lot of calls and a lot of inquiries about election integrity, and a lot of folks worried about the counting of ballots and whether they're going to be done timely. And that's been a big concern on a lot of folks' minds right now. So with that said, back in 2020, we can recap what happened.
Yeah.
In September of 2020, late September, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court rewrote, in my opinion, illegally rewrote the Pennsylvania election code, and they changed what was Act 77, which was not supposed to be changed. It was a severability clause in there that said if any part of that was changed, that the entire law was thrown out. But yet the court changed that. They created drop boxes, and what they did in 2020 was they made a total mess out of the election in the state of Pennsylvania. So to this day, there's many people that doubt the outcome of the presidential election. So with that said, here in the State House, after that, we actually worked on legislation, House Bill 1300 of 2021, which was actually passed by the House and the Senate. It had a voter ID in there. It provided opportunities for ballot security and making sure that every vote was counted. It allowed for early voting and easier access to the polls. Every Democrat voted against that, of course, because of the requirement for voter ID, and Governor Wolf vetoed it. So then fast forward, we then passed Act 88, knowing that there's still an issue with the counting of ballots and the timeliness of the results. People in Pennsylvania are accustomed to knowing the outcome of the election by midnight, before you go to bed on election night, provided there's not a close election or an election where they have to wait for military ballots overseas or for provisional ballots to be counted, as we've seen up in Luzerne County, which played out for months. And interesting to note, back in 2020, the Secretary of State, Bugvar, actually resigned after the election because she had so botched the administration of that election. But with that said, what Act 88 did was it provided security and transparency measures and also funding for counties. If they applied for a grant, the stipulation was that they got this grant funding, they then would have to continue counting ballots until all the ballots were counted. None of this, we're going to pack up, go home, and come back the next day to count ballots.
So when would that start? That would start
that actually started
8 a.m. on Election Day, or what time would
7
that
a.m.
start?
on Election Day, canvassing of the ballots, and then the counting of the ballots. And so I think I still get a lot of questions about the mail-in ballot and the processes. Now, it was altered by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and they created drop boxes, which I don't agree with. But all that aside, what happens when somebody requests a mail-in ballot? So you have up to October 21st in the state of Pennsylvania to register to vote in the November 5th election. So if you're not already registered and you want to vote, October 21st. You then have up to 5 p.m. on October 29th to request a mail-in ballot if you so choose to vote by mail, or if you want to go in person to vote. If you get that mail-in ballot in the mail, after you apply for it, you'll receive the mail-in ballot. You then you have the envelope that the ballot goes in, and then you have the outside envelope. And the outside envelope, you have to sign it, you have to date it. It's important. And dates matter because there's only so many days that you can vote in a year. And it seems like when you're signing a petition, a nominating petition to get on the ballot, you have to sign and date it. And if the dates are wrong, they throw it out. So that is something that was in statute, and the courts upheld it, although the Shapiro administration has been trying to circumvent that. But that's another scenario. So they would take the ballot, you would complete your ballot, you then put it in an enclosed envelope. And your name isn't on the ballot or on that envelope. That envelope goes inside of the mail-in ballot envelope, which you then put that information and sign it and date it on the outside. You then mail that back. The ballots are then held until Election Day, and they're opened. If all the information is correct on the outside, they then take those ballots and put them on a pile, and then they scan those ballots in according to the precinct that you vote in.
Sure.
So with that said, you can also vote in person, and you can go to the ballot in person and vote on Election Day, and that is November 5th. If you have a mail-in ballot, you can take it to the elections office in person. So if you have your ballot in hand, you can turn it in at the elections office, or they can mail it in. So if you are voting by mail, make sure that you're going to get it mailed in time to be counted. It has to be in the elections office by 8 p.m. on November 5th. It has to be turned into the elections office because that's a deadline, right? If you vote in person or you vote by mail, that's the election ends that day. Except for military ballots that are overseas, they do allow them a couple of extra days to come in because those folks are serving their countries in sometimes hostile areas.
I think one important question about mail-in ballots is, let's just say you opt in to request a mail-in ballot. Do you still have the option to go in person to vote instead and then hand over the uncompleted mail-in ballot to the judge of elections at your precinct?
Yes.
Is that an option?
So there is an option that you can take that in and you can vote. However, I would caution for voters, make sure if you can go to your precinct and vote, I would say go to your elections office and turn in your mail-in ballot. And here's why. Provisional ballots. So anytime anybody goes to vote, if you show up at the polls and you say, I'm Hunter Kipe, I live here, I'm registered here, I want to vote, and the judge of election says your name's not on the rolls, you can still vote by provisional ballot.
Okay.
At which time they would have time to double check that you are who you are and that you are entitled to vote there. It could be that you maybe have to go to a different precinct to vote. So if you take that mail-in ballot in, you have to then vote by a provisional ballot.
Okay.
And here's the difference. You have to fill that provisional ballot has to be filled out exactly right, and then it's submitted, and then after all the votes are counted, those ballots are opened up, and then they are verified, and then they are counted. Provisional ballots are subject to legal processes. So if somebody says somebody can challenge that provisional ballot, and it can actually be thrown out, and that's what held up the Luzerne County, that primary, right?
Yeah.
And there were several provisional ballots, and there were a lot of provisional ballots back in 2020 that people thought they voted and it wasn't filled out right. Maybe the judge of elections, and the judges of elections are just people, right?
I dealt with it in 2020. I was the judge of elections during that election cycle, and it was crazy because we weren't used to that process, and it was something that we were figuring out, but it was a nightmare.
And there was a lot of misguidance that was given by the Secretary of State, Bukvar, who then resigned afterwards. So there were issues, and we're not going to get into rehashing that. But what we want to do is make sure that if you're listening to this podcast, we want to make sure that if you're Democrat, Republican, Independent, Libertarian, that your vote is counted. So I would say if you get that mail-in ballot, and you still want to go vote in person, you can do that, but you're going to vote by provisional. I would caution again, it is an avenue that you can do, but if you have that mail-in ballot in hand and you fill it out and you take it to your county elections office, you can hand it to them and turn it in person rather than waiting in line or anything like that. So I think it's important that people understand the processes that are in place. But knowing that a lot of this was set up by the very liberal, progressive Democratic Supreme Court, which rewrote the law. And I can't stress that enough because it's a point of frustration on my end that people are now challenging or questioning the election integrity because of what this court had done.
No, it's upsetting. In Carbon County, are there ballot drop-off boxes, or do you have to physically go into the election office to hand in your mail-in ballot? Or if you don't mail it, do you have to physically hand it in the election office?
Yes, in Carbon County, as of right now, and this would be up to the county commissioners, that we are recording this here in mid-August, so they could change by then. But as of right now, there are no drop boxes in Carbon County. Carbon County is a very small county, but you can go to the elections office on Susquehanna Street in Jim Thorpe, and they usually set up a couple of parking spots, and you can park there for free, take it into the elections office, and hand it in person. But it's interesting to note, it has to be Hunter has to turn in Hunters.
Yes.
Doyle has to turn in Doyle's. So that is important. If you do have a mail-in ballot, and maybe and you're afraid maybe it's 2 days before the election, then I would suggest taking it to the elections office and turning it in. If you're a week out, you can take it right to their post office, whether it be you could drop it off at the Jim Thorpe post office, which is right next to the courthouse, and I'm sure it'll be there the next day. But whatever you do, make sure that you fill it in. Myself, I'm very anxious. We can't talk politics, so we're not going to talk about who I'm voting for, but I can tell you that I am so anxious to vote this November that I am going to get my mail-in ballot, and I am going to be probably one of the first ones to fill it out, complete it, and take it up and drop it off, and make sure that my vote is cast early, because I am so revved up to fired up to vote this November. But with that said, I just it's something I think that people really need to understand. Obviously, I support voter ID. Right now, the state of Pennsylvania has not been passed into law. The House Democrats have been holding that up. The Senate passed it. It could easily have been on a ballot initiative in the primary to determine whether Pennsylvanians want to have to show a ID every time you go to vote. I think there's things we could do to provide more election integrity. There's really no excuse, and I would call on the Shapiro administration and Pennsylvania Secretary of State Al Schmidt to ensure that every ballot is counted and that the election results are determined before we go to bed on election night. Hinging on that it's not such a close election that there's still outstanding, whether they be military or ballots that still have to be returned or provisional ballots to be counted. We should know the results before we go to bed.